The morning Pruitt Harlan put his stepdaughter up for settlement, he wore his good hat. That was the detail Wren Calloway remembered most. Not the crowd gathered outside the land office, not the smell of sawdust and horse sweat baking in the July heat, not even her own hands trembling inside her apron pockets. What she remembered was the hat. The one he only wore to church and to occasions he considered important. He had pressed it careful that morning, smoothed the brim with 2 fingers the way he always did before something he thought would benefit him. She had known, even then, what kind of day it was going to be. Wren was 28 years old and had lived in Harlan's house for 11 of them, since her mother married him and then died trying to give him a son. She knew his moods the way you know the weather. Not by looking up, but by the feeling in your joints before the rain comes. And that morning, standing in the doorway of the land office with her hands clasped in front of her and the whole town of Gulliver Creek watching, she understood that Pruitt had finally found a way to make her someone else's problem. "Girl's a hard worker," he was saying to the room. "Strong. Knows how to run a household." He didn't say her name, she noticed that. The land office served as courthouse, post office, and general gathering place in Gulliver Creek, and on the 3rd Thursday of every month, it also served as the place where disputes got settled, deals got made, and occasionally arrangements got finalized. Pruitt Harlan had called in a debt. The man who owed him, a cattle broker named Sutter, had proposed an arrangement in lieu of payment. He knew a rancher who needed a wife fast for reasons he didn't explain. The rancher had land, a house, and no interest in being matched through the usual channels. He wanted something practical, a settlement. Pruitt had agreed before Sutter finished the sentence. Wren had found out the same way she found out most things, by standing still in a hallway and listening through a door. She had 2 choices, as she understood them. She could refuse, which meant leaving Harlan's house with nothing but the dress she was wearing and no family name that would open any doors in a town this size. Or she could go through with it, meet this rancher, and make the best of whatever it turned out to be. She was not a woman given to self-pity. Her mother had raised her before the sickness took over, and her mother had believed that self-pity was a luxury for people who had time to spare. Wren had her mother's hands, wide-palmed, capable, and she had her mother's practicality, which had served her better than beauty ever would have in a life like this. She stood straight when the door to the back room opened. The man who walked out was not what she'd expected. She had imagined someone like Pruitt, thick through the middle, pleased with himself, the kind of man who treated a wife the way he treated his land, something to be owned and managed. What she got instead was a man who looked like he hadn't slept well in a long time. He was tall, spare, with weathered skin and dark eyes that moved across the room carefully before settling on her. He wore a plain coat, no adornment, and he held his hat in his hands rather than on his head. His name, Sutter said, was Ambrose Taggart. He looked at her the way she'd looked at the situation herself, like he was calculating what he was walking into and had already decided to be honest about not knowing. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Taggart," she said. Pruitt started to say something about terms. Ambrose held up one hand, not rude, just clear, and Pruitt stopped talking. It was the first time Wren had seen Pruitt Harlan stop talking because someone asked him to. "I'd like to speak with her," Ambrose said. "Alone." The room shuffled. Men went to look at paperwork that didn't need looking at. Pruitt took his good hat and his wounded pride to the far end of the counter. Sutter went outside, and Wren found herself standing 3 feet from a stranger in the middle of a land office, with everyone pretending not to watch. "I'm going to be straight with you," Ambrose said, quieted enough that it didn't carry. "I don't know what he told you about me." "Nothing," she said. "He told me nothing." Something in his face shifted, just slightly. "Then I'll tell you myself. I have a ranch outside town. It's solvent barely. I have a daughter. She's 9. Her mother passed 2 years ago, and my daughter has stopped speaking." He paused. "Not from grief, the doctor says. He thinks she's speaking somewhere inside herself. She just won't let it out. She needs—" He stopped again, looked at the hat in his hands. "She needs someone patient, someone who won't treat her like she's broken." Wren was quiet for a moment. "And you?" she said. "What do you need?" He looked up. It seemed like the question surprised him. "Honestly, someone who won't leave," he said. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't meant to be. But it was the most truthful thing a man had said to her in 11 years. And Wren Calloway, who had learned to measure people by whether they said what they meant, filed it away somewhere close to her chest. "All right," she said. The papers were signed. Pruitt got his debt cleared. Sutter got his commission. And Wren got into a wagon beside a stranger and rode 7 miles out of Gulliver Creek, toward a life she knew nothing about except that it was hers to make something of. The ranch was called the Tag, which was short for Taggart, which Ambrose said with a flatness that told her he hadn't chosen the name himself. His father had built it. His father was dead. The land was real. She could see that good grazing land, a creek that ran clean, a house that needed work but was solid in its bones. His daughter's name was Petra. She was sitting on the porch steps when the wagon pulled up, small and dark-eyed like her father, watching Wren the way a barn cat watches something new enter its territory. Not with fear, exactly, but with deep and patient assessment. Wren climbed down from the wagon. She didn't go to the girl. She didn't crouch down and offer her hand, or say something cheerful about looking forward to getting to know each other. She had a sense, looking at Petra, that the girl had been subjected to a good number of cheerful approaches in the past 2 years, and had found all of them wanting. Instead, Wren looked at the garden on the south side of the house. Overgrown, the late summer squash going to seed, a tangle of what might have been herbs once, and said mostly to herself, "That soil looks like it's been neglected since spring." She didn't look at Petra when she said it, but from the corner of her eye she saw the girl's chin lift slightly. Ambrose showed her the house. It was clean enough. He'd done that himself. She could tell, recently, the kind of cleaning that misses corners because it's done by someone who doesn't live in the corners. There were 3 rooms and a sleeping loft. There was a kitchen with a good iron stove and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. There was a photograph on the mantel of a woman with Petra's eyes, and a laugh that translated even through the stillness of the image. Wren stood in front of it for a moment. "She was good," Ambrose said, from behind her. "She looks it," Wren said. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. That first night she made supper from what she found in the pantry. Dried beans, salt pork, cornbread from memory, and set 3 places at the table. Ambrose ate without comment. Petra came and sat and ate without comment. And Wren ate and looked out the kitchen window and thought that silence, at least, was something she knew how to be comfortable in. After supper, Petra took herself up to the loft. Ambrose poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of her. She drank it. "She likes you," he said. "She doesn't know me yet," Wren said. "No, but she sat through supper." He looked at his cup. "That's the first time since February." Wren didn't say anything. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic and watched the lamp throw its circle against the wall, and she thought about what it meant to be somewhere long enough for people to start measuring your presence in small improvements. The town knew, of course. Towns like Gulliver Creek always knew. She heard it the first time she went in for supplies. Not anything said directly, nothing so honest as that. It was in the way the woman behind the counter at the dry goods store smiled at her, the particular smile that holds more information than it gives. It was in the way 2 women on the street paused their conversation when she walked past. It was in the way Sutter's wife, a small bird-boned woman named Cecilia, touched her arm and said she hoped Wren was settling in all right with an expression that meant she hoped no such thing. Wren had been navigating this particular social current for most of her life. She knew how to move through it without getting pulled under. She bought what she needed, thanked the woman at the counter by name she'd asked on the way in, and drove the wagon home herself. What she found when she got back was Petra in the garden, pulling weeds. Not all of them, and not efficiently. Just the ones around the squash, careful, the way a child does something when they're trying to figure out if it's worth the effort. Wren unloaded the supplies and then came around the side of the house and crouched down a few feet away and started pulling weeds herself without saying anything. They worked side by side for 20 minutes. Then Petra held up a small green caterpillar on the end of her finger and looked at Wren. "Hornworm," Wren said. "They'll eat the whole plant if you leave them." Petra set it down carefully in the dirt a few feet away from the garden. Wren looked at her. "Your call," she said, and something, not quite a smile, but the shape that a smile starts from, moved across the girl's face. That was the beginning. Ambrose worked from before sunrise until after dark most days, the way ranchers do in summer, and Wren learned the rhythms of the tag, the way she'd learned most things in her life, by watching carefully, asking practical questions, and doing the work in front of her without waiting for permission. She repaired the south fence with wire and pliers she found in the barn. She replanted the herb garden in rows she could actually manage. She salted and stored the last of the summer vegetables. She found a crack in the root cellar wall and mixed a paste of clay and straw to seal it before the cold came. She did not ask Ambrose if she was doing these things correctly. She knew she was doing them correctly. When he noticed, and he did notice, Coming home one evening to find the fence line fixed and the cellar patched, he stood for a moment looking at it, and then he looked at her and he said, "You didn't have to do all that." "It needed doing," she said. He nodded slowly. "Where'd you learn the cellar mix?" "My mother. She said a house that breathes cold in the root cellar loses half its winter stores." He was quiet for a moment. Then, she was right. It was not a conversation exactly, but it was a thing that passed between them, a recognition. She knew what she was doing, and he knew that she knew, and in a life as practical as theirs, that mattered. The trouble came in October, the way trouble in small towns usually does, through a relative. Ambrose had a cousin, a man named Gareth, who ranched 40 miles north and came through Gulliver Creek twice a year on his way to sell cattle at the stockyards in Abilene. He was loud in the way men are loud when they've always had the floor. He shook hands too hard. He laughed at his own stories before he finished telling them. He arrived on a Tuesday and was inside the house before Wren fully understood who he was. He looked at her the way Pruitt Harlan had looked at her stepmother's furniture after her mother died. Cataloging, assessing, noting what he'd do differently. "Didn't know you'd gone and done this, Ambrose," he said, the smile just shy of the words. "Wren," Ambrose said, "this is my cousin Gareth, ma'am." Gareth tipped his head toward her. Nice that Ambrose found someone to take on the cooking. He said it pleasantly, which was the worst way a thing like that could be said. Wren set down the pot she was holding, calm, took her time about it. "Mr. Taggart takes his turn in the kitchen same as I do," she said. "It's how a household functions when both people have real work to do." Gareth's smile stayed exactly where it was, but the warmth went out of it. Ambrose was looking at his boots, or appearing to, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that had changed. At supper that night, Gareth dominated the conversation, the way he always did in rooms he considered his. He talked about cattle prices and county politics, and a lawsuit between two ranchers up north that he seemed to find entertaining. He talked about the Taggart land, how his father had said the tag could have been twice what it was with smarter management. He talked without looking at Wren, which was its own kind of commentary. Petra, who had started taking her meals at the table again, sat at the far end and watched Gareth the way she watched things that made no sense to her, with a focused, unimpressed attention. After supper, Gareth told Ambrose he ought to think about selling the east pasture, that the price was good this season, and he knew a buyer in Caldwell who'd pay fair. Ambrose said he'd think about it. Later, when Gareth had gone to the bunkhouse and Petra had gone to the loft, and it was just the two of them with the cleared table and the cooling lamp, Wren said, "That east pasture runs along the creek." "Yes," Ambrose said. "If you sell it, you lose water access for the summer herd." He was quiet. "I know," he said. She nodded and picked up the lamp to take to bed, and he said behind her, "Wren." She turned. He looked like a man choosing between two ways of saying the same thing. "Thank you," he said finally, for he stopped, started again, for not leaving him with the field he was looking for. She understood what he meant, a field. The wide, empty space a man like Gareth was always hunting, the one he could fill up with his version of things if no one held the ground. "I don't leave fields," she said, and took the lamp. Gareth left Wednesday morning, and the tag went quiet again the way it did, which was not exactly silent. The animals made their sounds. The wind moved across the grassland. Petra moved through the house with her particular careful footstep, but it was a quiet that belonged to the people in it, and Wren had come to know the difference. She had been at the tag for 4 months. She knew which floorboard to step over on her way to the kitchen before dawn. She knew that Ambrose drank his coffee too fast and burned his tongue and never mentioned it. She knew that Petra had a book she kept under her pillow and read by the light of the window. On nights the moon was cooperative. She knew the name of every horse in the barn by the sounds they made in the morning, and she knew which pasture needed tending before the first hard frost. She had learned the tag the way she had learned most things worth learning, from the inside out, slow, without announcing herself. One morning in late October, Petra came to the kitchen before Ambrose was up and sat at the table with her hands flat in front of her. Wren was making porridge. She didn't turn around. Then Petra said, in a voice that sounded like a door being opened that hadn't been opened in a very long time, "Can I help?" Wren stood still for a single moment. Then she turned, the spoon still in her hand, and said, "You can stir." She said it the same way she would have said it any other morning. No ceremony. No fuss. Because she understood, in the way she understood most important things, that the girl didn't need to be witnessed right now. She just needed to stir. Petra crossed the kitchen and took the spoon. When Ambrose came down, his daughter was standing at the stove. He stopped in the doorway. Wren was at the table, cutting bread, not looking at him, giving him the room to absorb it without an audience. She heard him pull out a chair. She heard him sit down, and then she heard, barely, the sound of him breathing through something large and private that he kept entirely to himself. She didn't look up. After a moment he said, "Morning, morning," she said. And Petra at the stove said, "Morning, Papa," in the voice that sounded like a door opening, and Ambrose said nothing back because he couldn't, quite, but that was all right. In November, the first hard frost came, and the creek froze at the edges, and Wren put up the last of the stores and banked the kitchen fire the right way for the cold season, and Ambrose came in from the north pasture one evening with ice on his coat and sat down at the table and said, "I need to ask you something." She poured him coffee. "I haven't been fair to you," he said. She sat down. "What do you mean, this arrangement?" He turned the cup in his hands. "I know what it cost you, what that whole business cost you." She was quiet. "I'd like to give you the choice again," he said, "with more information than you had the first time." He looked up. "I would like to ask you properly if you'd stay, not as a settlement, not as an arrangement." He paused. "As my wife." Wren looked at him for a long time. She thought about the morning in the land office, the good hat, Pruitt's voice cataloging her usefulness. She thought about the wagon ride out here, the 7 miles of not knowing. She thought about Petra at the stove with the spoon, and the east pasture that ran along the creek, and the root cellar sealed with clay, and the coffee this man brought her every morning now without being asked. "Ambrose," she said, "I've been your wife." He looked at her. "I mean," she said, "yes, but I want it on record that I've already been doing the job." It was the closest thing to a joke either of them had managed in 4 months, and it cracked something open in the room. He laughed, just briefly, the way people laugh when they've been holding something tight for a long time, and something shifts. "Noted," he said. She stood up, pushed back her chair. On her way past him, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He put his hand over hers for a moment, and then she went to bank the fire for the night, and that was that. The winter of that year was hard in the way that winters in that country tend to be, relentless and quiet and long, but the tag held, the stores held, the herd came through with fewer losses than the 2 ranches east of them, the root cellar kept, sealed tight, dry and cold and full. Petra began to speak more, not all at once but in pieces, the way ice thaws. First the edges, then the surface, then gradually the whole structure loosens, and you realize the water has been moving underneath all along. She spoke to Wren first, mostly about practical things, the garden, the horses, a book she'd been reading that she thought Wren might like, then to her father, then carefully, to the world beyond the tag, in the way a child will test a new confidence before they trust it. Wren did not make much of it. She accepted it the way she accepted most good things, gratefully, practically, without needing to hold it up to the light. In the spring, the woman behind the counter at the dry goods store called her by her first name, and meant it. The particular smile was gone. In the spring, Gareth came through again on his way to the stockyards, and this time he sat at a different kind of table. Petra was there, speaking. The east pasture was still on the tag. And Wren served supper without ceremony and sat down and said, when Gareth started talking about county politics, "I heard they're pushing the water rights bill again. You have holdings on the Cimarron. That affects you directly." Gareth looked at her the way people look at something they've underestimated when it shows them what it actually is. Yes," he said. "It does." And the conversation went from there, and it went from there because she had moved it, and that was how most conversations in that house went now. Later that spring, on an evening when the light came low and golden across the tag, the way it only does in that hour just before it leaves entirely, Wren was sitting on the south porch with a cup of coffee, and Petra was in the garden, and Ambrose was coming across the yard from the barn. And he stopped when he saw her sitting there, and she saw him stop, and look at her the way he'd begun to look at her that winter, like she was something he was still surprised every time to find here. She had not come to this life gracefully. She had not been given it as a gift. It had been arranged and transacted, and she had walked into it with her eyes open because there was no other option, and she was not a woman who closed her eyes when options ran out. But it was hers. That was the thing she had come to understand, slowly, the way she understood most things that mattered. The tag was hers. Petra was hers, in the way a child becomes yours not through blood but through being there, morning after morning, at the stove, with the spoon. Ambrose was hers in the way a person becomes yours when they tell you the truth in the first 5 minutes and then keep telling it. She had not been sold into anything good. She had made something good out of what she'd been handed, and the difference between those two things was the whole distance between who she'd been in Pruitt Harlan's house and who she was now, sitting in the low light on the porch of a ranch that held through the winter, because she had sealed the root cellar and tended the stores and held the ground when there was ground to hold. Ambrose crossed the yard and came up on the porch and sat beside her, and she handed him her cup without being asked, because she knew he'd want coffee and he didn't have any, and it was easier than getting up. He took it. They sat in the last of the light, the two of them, and Petra moved through the garden below, and from somewhere in the north pasture, one of the horses called out and another answered, and the tag settled into evening the way it always did, with a sound that was low and constant and entirely its own. She wasn't sure she had the words for any of it. She'd never been much for words. But the ground was solid under her feet, and the sky above the tag went pink and then purple and then deep, and she had learned slowly, from the inside out, that some things do not need to be named to be true.